Hi everyone! Welcome to the Creative Glow if you're new here, and if you are, I hope that you will consider subscribing to my channel. And welcome back to everyone who are regular followers. I'm really grateful to have you guys all here. So as the title of this video suggests, I will be reviewing some ARTEZA art supplies in this video. So a few weeks ago, ARTEZA reached out to me and they asked me if I would like to try some of their art supplies and do a review video. And I thought that that would be really fun and would be a great fit for this channel, so I said sure. So I was sent these products for free, but I wasn't compensated in any other way besides just the free products, and I wasn't asked to give positive feedback or anything like that, just to try the products out and do a little review on them. So that's what you can expect from this video. Just my honest opinion in playing around with these products. So I was able to choose the products that I wanted to try, and I asked to try some gouache paints and some oil paints along with some paper and canvases or something to go along with those two mediums. So in this video I will be reviewing their gouache paints, and they sent me this awesome 60 tube set of gouache paints, and I'll also be reviewing their 12 metallic gouache colors, as well as this watercolor or Expert Watercolor paper pad. So I'll talk more about these products as the video goes on, and I'll give you a little bit more of a description of each one of them. As for the oil paints and canvases, the oil paints were out of stock when they sent me the products, but they did send me a package of 4 18 by 24 inch premium stretch canvases, and I will review those in a separate video once I get the oil paints. Those should be coming. And this video is going to be a pretty extensive review of these products anyhow, so that's probably best. So while I talk about these products, you can watch me create this little Harborview gouache painting, and I'll also throw in some other clips here and there of some of the tests and close-ups of the final paintings themselves. I actually ended up doing 3, but we'll get into that. So the first thing I did when I received these art supplies in the mail, of course, was a very fun color chart. I've never done one of these before, actually. I never really felt the need to, but I see everyone else doing them and they look so much fun, and I wasn't disappointed. It was really, really fun just to play with the paints and see what colors they were. So this is a really fun way to test out the pigmentation, the transparency and opaqueness, and the consistency of all the colors in this 60-piece gouache set, since you'd be hard-pressed to use every single one of these colors in a single piece of art, I think. But that actually kind of sounds like a great challenge video, so who knows, maybe that will happen. Anyway, when making the color chart, I was extremely impressed with these gouache paints. The colors are highly pigmented and they remain so even when you water them down to transparent washes, but they are very opaque in their pure right out of the tube form, as you can tell from the black strips that I drew across the blocks and then painted these swatches over top of, and you can see that these gouache paints really do have fantastic coverage. So however you like to use your gouache paints, either thick or more transparent, similar to watercolors, you really should definitely be happy with these paints in that regard. Their consistency is also very nice and creamy. It's neither too thick or too runny, so I really like that. The only tube that was a bit weird was the titanium white. It actually appeared to have a grainy texture out of the tube, and I'm showing you that right here on the screen, but that didn't affect my painting or my color mixtures at all, so I feel that that's actually really trivial. I don't really think that matters, and a little swirl with the brush and it was as smooth as any of the other colors. So I think that that's not really a concern. So these tested really well in all those areas. When it comes to the packaging, each one of these tubes has the information about that gouache color printed on it, like the name of the color and the pigments used in that color, as well as the transparency and light fastness. And this info can also be found on the box, so that if you're trying to decide on a color or pigment, you can look it up without actually having to dig through the entire set when planning a color palette. And additionally, when it comes to the packaging, this large set of gouache paints also comes really nicely packaged in a sturdy box, and then these little plastic organizing trays, which can continue to serve as a great storage for the set, and that is how I like to keep them organized. And speaking of the size of the set, I'm actually really big on stressing to people that you never need all the colors when it comes to paints, even though it is so much fun to have all the colors. Really, for the most part, a more limited palette of a cool and warm version of your primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and plus a white, that's really all you need to get started painting. And if you guys want a little bit more of an explanation on that topic, just let me know in the comment section, and I'd really be happy to make a video all about it. Because there are some exceptions, so it's hard to make a statement like that without explanation, and this is a review video, so I won't cover that here. But back to having all these paint colors. In this case, where I was painting gouache, I actually really enjoyed having the color variety because gouache paints, they dry very quickly, and having more of those convenience colors means taking less time for mixing. And I also really liked having a great variety of reds and pinks for painting these little flower studies that I also did, especially for that vibrant pink ranunculus. I do find that floral paintings are one of those exceptions I spoke of earlier when it comes to having more than just primary colors in your palette, because you do need to have a lot of pinks and magentas and fuchsias when painting those vibrant flowers, and you can't really get those really bright magentas, pinks, fuchsias with just a red and a white paint, or even red and blue and white. That's not going to give you anything vibrant. But on top of having a variety of those vibrant colors in this set, the fact that those vibrant colors stayed vibrant when they dried and when they were watered down to more transparent washes really makes me feel like the quality of these paints and the pigments used are really quite decent. And now let's check out the metallic colors. They also have a nice variety of those with 12 different colors. So they also sent me, as I mentioned at the top of the video, a set of the 12 metallic colors, even though when I was doing my color chart, I noticed that the 60 gouache set actually already has those 12 metallic colors in there, so I didn't really need that additional set. So that's something for you guys to keep in mind, that if you are interested in both the regular gouache colors and metallic colors, you don't have to buy the two sets. And if you are interested in only adding the metallic colors to your supply of gouache paints that you already have, then you can get those 12 metallics separately. And they really make a great addition to embellishing original gouache or watercolor paintings, which is what I use them for in the two smaller flower paintings. So the first softer and lighter colored peony painting was my first attempt at using the metallic colors, and I will admit that it took some trial and error to figure out how best to use them alongside the regular gouache paints. So that's why I felt the need to give it a second shot in the bright pink ranunculus flower painting. As I said, I feel like the metallic paints work best as embellishments, since the metallic appearance gets kind of swallowed up when you mix them with any of the regular gouache colors, but you can mix the metallic colors with one another to create custom metallic tints. You definitely can't paint over the metallic colors with the regular gouache paints and still have any of the pearlescent effect shine through. Since gouache paints are mainly quite opaque, it really does cover over that metallic appearance almost completely. Once I figured all that out, and then I used them in my second attempt just to embellish the painting after it was dry, they really do look quite lovely, and they really do have an impressive metallic sheen to them. Some of the colors are more apparently pearlescent than the others, but the amount of light that bounces off of them seems increased when you use them over top of already painted and dried areas, like I said, as embellishments. My guess is this is because the paper is already sealed with a layer of paint, so when the metallics go over it, the paper doesn't absorb or suck up as much of the mica, which is what's used to make the paints appear metallic, and more of that remains on the surface. So that's why the sheen is increased. So as you may have guessed, I really did like both the regular ARTEZA gouache paints and the metallic colors for embellishing paintings. I feel like these paints are of a good quality, and I would definitely rate them higher than student grade gouache paint since their coverage and pigmentation are so impressive. Now, the only downfall to these paints are that I found the tubes to be quite small. They're only about the size of a lot of watercolor paint tubes, and they could stand to be bigger in my opinion, since gouache paints are often painted using less water than a watercolor paint, and so you'll end up using a larger quantity of paint than with watercolor paint. And then the other thing that I found was a bit of a negative is that you can't buy any of the paint colors as single tubes of paint. You can only buy them in these sets. So if you use a lot of one color for your artwork, then you can't really replenish just that color, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense to purchase an entire set of 60 paints just to get that one color. I don't think anybody would do that. As you might know, this makes it extremely difficult when it comes to titanium white, which, if you're a regular painter, you know that you run out of that way faster than any other tube. But when I think about it, maybe that's why they have such a large set. So you have all of these convenience colors that are already mixed, and then I guess you could cut back on your mixing needs and how much white you use. I don't know. That's just a theory. I think it would be ideal if they sold all the colors separately as well as in sets, but even if this 60-piece set at least included a larger size of titanium white, I think that would be helpful. And on top of that suggestion, if they made more gouache sets for certain types of painters, like a floral palette or a landscape palette or a portrait palette, etc. So then you could get sets and replenish colors that you use most based on your style of painting. Anyhow, those are my critiques of the gouache paints. But I really did find the paints themselves to be really quite nice, and I'll definitely continue to use mine. Okay, let's move on to the paper they sent me to try. So I showed it at the beginning of the video, but I was sent this 14-sheet, 9x12-inch Expert Watercolor pad. And it says on the cover that it's 100% cotton, that's great. It's mold made, cold pressed, so it has a rougher texture than a hot pressed paper, if you're not familiar with those two different types. And most importantly, it's acid free, so that's also great. And for the weight of this paper, it's 140 pounds or 300 grams. Besides just doing the 3 little gouache paintings on this paper, I did a few other tests on it to see how well it handles being taped and peeled, maintaining color vibrancy, absorption of pigments, erasing, repeated layering of washes, and how flat it dries without proper stretching. First, I'll say that I was impressed and pleased with the feel of the weight and texture of the paper. It feels really nice to me with that typical rough texture of a high quality cold pressed watercolor paper. When I made my gouache paintings, I was quite pleased with the results of those too. Now, let me state that I feel the most important things when it comes to a watercolor paper are first, what the paper is made of and whether it is acid free, to ensure the longevity of your artwork that you work so hard on. And secondly, if you're satisfied with the results of your artwork on that paper. But since I'm just one artist and other people will have different qualities that they look for in a paper, I feel like it's really only fair that I test the paper in ways that may be important to other artists' processes as well, and not just mine. And having said that, a lot of the following observations that I made may be positives or even negatives to any given artist. It really basically comes down to preference a lot of the time, because some people like a rough texture and some people don't like a rough texture. Some people like graininess, some people don't, and so on. So let's take a look at the tests. Now, as I said, the most important qualities in a paper are its composition and whether it is acid-free. Acid-free is a must when it comes to any artwork that you want to last a very long time. If a paper is not acid-free, it will yellow over time. Think of a newspaper that starts to get old, for an extreme example, because that really does occur very quickly. So this paper states that it is acid-free right on the cover. Some people telling people how to test papers go really extreme, and they test the acidity level of the paper with a pH strip or pH marker. But I think if a company states acid-free, and it probably is, unless you have a reason to think that a company is misrepresenting their products, then I'd trust what it states on the packaging. But by all means, if you want to do those tests, go for it. As far as the paper being 100% cotton, this you can really see in how even washes and gradients dry. This is a telltale sign of a cotton paper. You can see here that I laid in a very wet wash of ultramarine blue, and it dried to an even and consistent color throughout. So that's a really good test. I also tested merging two colors to form a gradient effect, and you can see that it handled that quite nicely. Both colors blended together, but they stayed in that general spot that I wanted them to. Red with a nice gradiated band of blue, not some weird jumbled up mess of a purplish looking hue. And then I added a second layer of that red and blue paints to see how it would affect the existing dry gradient underneath. And it turned out pretty well with a bit of blooming in just this one area. So I used a clean wet brush to try to even it back out just to see how that would affect it, see if it was possible. And I was able to get it back to quite an even gradient. So I'm really quite pleased with that. If you take a look at the single color gradients I did in both gouache and watercolor, just to see if there was a difference in how the paper handled these two mediums, you can see there was a tiny amount of unevenness or blooming in the watercolor test, where I had re-wet my brush so that I could continue to dilute that paint down to just the bare paper to complete the gradient, but I feel like it's barely noticeable. Here I created this blue gradient without lifting my brush and therefore without introducing any more moisture, and it turned out incredibly even with zero blooming, so that's really great. And if you look at the gouache test, you can see that it's a completely smooth gradient from the pure pigment through to the white of the paper, even though I did introduce a re-wetted brush at a couple of spots as well to complete that gradient. So those are really nice results. And testing how well the paper handles extreme wet washes, I laid down this extremely pigmented and very, very wet swatch of violet just to see what the paper does with the excess water. And it appears, once it dried, as though the paper does handle the over wet areas very well. And it tries to absorb the moisture evenly all over, and that creates an even wash in both the purer, darker pigment swatch and the lighter, more watered down, transparent swatch. I then really soaked a larger area with lots and lots of water and then added several different colors into that wet area so that I could try to track how the water moves while it's drying. And you can see that I did get some blooming effects here, but they are really minimal considering the amount of water that was on that paper, and you can tell it really does want to even itself out and soften all the edges. If you take a look at the swatch about midway through drying, you can see where the water pooled as the paper kind of buckled and sort of made a bowl for the water to sit in. But then once it was completely dry, you can't really notice those pooled areas all that much, and the darkest spots are actually more where the pigment started to settle and absorb into the paper as it was trying to migrate into those pooled areas. But when your paper is properly stretched before painting, any of this buckling will smooth out as it dries, and therefore the wetness will have less areas to pool, and that will result in even smoother gradients than in this test in any areas that are treated with an abundance of water. And by the way, if you want to know more about how to properly stretch watercolor paper in preparing for a painting, then I actually have a blog post that I did on that, and I will leave the link in the description. So if you're looking for more information on that, look for that link. Masking tape, as you see a lot of people do, is actually just a quick way to limit the buckling of your watercolor paper when it dries, but there is really no substitute for stretching your paper the more traditional way when it comes to getting a very flat watercolor painting once it's dried. I promise you that. So, as I said, go check that out. Anyway, back to the paper test. When testing how the paper handles a re-wetting and lifting of pigments for corrections, I painted two swatches. which I showed for other purposes earlier. One in gouache and one in watercolor, and I tried to make sure I was using a very similar red. Once they were dry, I used my clean and dampened brush to start to re-wet and disturb that dried pigment, and then I sponge it up with a paper towel over and over. And you can see that it does start to lift quite nicely. It lifts a nice amount of pigment over several re-wetting and spongings from both of the watercolor and the gouache paints without removing it completely. Now again, this is really a preference when it comes to watercolor papers because it is nice to be able to lift pigments when you need to, but you also don't want them to completely lift away when you paint in layers. And this is just partially the nature of watercolor paper. And this is why when it comes to watercoloring, you work from light, more transparent washes, and then you move toward your darker, more pigmented applications toward the end of your painting. So that way you don't get a lot of smudging and smearing of your underlying layers. So in this other test, I applied a very pigmented pass and then a more transparent pass of violet. I let them dry, and then I washed over them with a light color, yellow, and it also does show that the paper does hold on to the pigments, but you do get some lifting and smearing from the brush, and I like to use a fairly stiff brush when I do watercolor work, so if you're using a softer watercolor brush, this might be more limited, but the edges of the underlying washes here still appear fairly crisp, and the edges really haven't softened that much from a pass of moisture over top of them. So personally, I do feel like this paper does allow for a nice amount of lifting, as I said, but someone else, they might like more lifting or less lifting. So either way, I think the test shows that the paper does have a nice absorbency, but not too much that you can't employ this lifting technique or quick washes over top of already dried layers. And again, as I talked about when I was reviewing the gouaches, the paints remained quite vibrant on this paper once they were dry, and you can see that in both gouache and watercolor. The next test I did in testing how this paper handles wetness was paint several wet washes of color over top of one another, letting them dry in between subsequent washes to see if the paper started to degrade at all. And then, as you can see, after 8 washes of color, the paper held up perfectly. I really don't see any visible signs of feathering of the fibers or any dissolving of the paper at all. So next, let's talk about erasing on this paper. So first, I just took a scrap piece that I had already drawn graphite lines on, and I erased those graphite lines from the bare paper using a high quality white eraser, and I used more pressure than I'd normally use when erasing lines, and I did it for longer than it took just to get rid of the graphite lines. So on first inspection, there's no visible damage to the paper after erasing or change in appearance at all. So then what I did is I painted a strip of ultramarine blue to cover part of the erased area and then part of the not erased area. And you can see those graphite lines through the paint where I didn't erase. And from this you can tell that the paper was unharmed from erasing. The dried paint appears evenly colored and textured across both the erased and the untouched areas. So then I tested erasing the graphite from over top of an already painted and dried area. So I just erased this little graphite scribble to see how well the paper holds on to the dry pigments. As you can see, I was able to erase the graphite completely away, and there was very minimal lifting of the pigment. So I think those are pretty good results there. Now when it comes to buckling of paper, this happens to all paper whenever it gets wet. And you can tell on this paper that small areas dry with minimal buckling, which is normal, and areas with large, very wet washes buckle more, also normal. This amount of buckling is actually not that bad, and it's a fairly normal amount for a cold pressed watercolor paper of this weight, where it wasn't taped or stretched to a board beforehand. And again, the weight of the paper is a preference. It also will come into play for how you're using it. When you actually look at the little gouache paintings I did, which I only taped them down to a stiff board, I didn't stretch them beforehand, they did dry relatively flat with only a little bit of curl to them. None of that funny warping or buckling left. if I had stretched them and let the paintings dry before releasing them from that sturdy board, I am quite confident that these would have dried completely flat. So again, check out my post on stretching your watercolor papers if you want really flat watercolor paintings. So you may also be curious to know how the paper stood up to peeling the tape away from the edges once my paintings had dried, and for the most part the results were good. On the first Harborview painting, I used painter's masking tape, and on the other two flower paintings, I used a pretty good washi tape. Normally I would use a painter's tape, or when I stretch my paper, I use a gummed craft paper tape. But even with this washi tape, the revealed edges were all very crisp and there wasn't any bleeding of paint. Be sure that you're pressing your tape around those edges really nicely, because that really helps to limit any paint bleed. Now on the first painting, the tape released with no damage. I didn't have any tearing or anything like that, but I did get a little bit of tearing on a couple of corners when I was peeling the tape back from the other two paintings. So it seems like it might make a difference what kind of tape you use, since I used the painter's tape on the first one and didn't get any tears, but with the washi tape I did. So that is one area that you might want to be extra careful with when using this paper. Okay, wow, that was some pretty extensive testing, but there you have it. My verdict on this paper is that it is a very nice paper, and I do think that you can use it for your professional watercolor paintings, but it's also nice even if you're a beginner because of the cost. I feel like you really can't beat the value of quality for price in this case, that's for sure. And if you'd like to try the Expert Watercolor Pad or any of the gouache paints that I showed here in this video, I will have all the products linked down in the description for you guys. And I also have a 10% off discount code, which you can also find in the description of this video. I don't know about you guys, but any day that has new art supplies is a great day for me. Also, if you're looking for more inspiration in using these products or any of ARTEZA's products, you can check out their YouTube channel and see what they have going on over there. So I hope that you guys really liked this review video, and if you did, click the thumbs up below. That really helps out my channel. And so does commenting and sharing. So if you have anything productive to add, please leave it down in the comments of this video. And if you know any friends that might like to hear about these ARTEZA products that I reviewed here today, then send this video their way. I hope you guys all have a super awesome day as usual, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!